I imagine you're talking about a lot of these very complex but also technologically dependent solutions where there are these irrigation systems or there are these particular type pallets of plants. Is that the only way to do it? I mean, what do you do in a developing country, in a country that doesn't have these margins to build with? Is this something that can only happen in places like Singapore?
I don't believe so. I mentioned there are many typologies of green walls. I'm referring specifically to vertical green walls.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. I mean, the simplest ones is grow a creeper up a wall. Like ficus in Singapore, up our you commonly see them on our flyovers where they grow up the pillars. Beautiful. It's a green wall, right? The ivy on a Victorian building, that's a green wall. And the next stage is, you grab on cables that's connected to 2 points, right? That's a green facade, vertical greenery, right? And then, of course, you can install meshes with a regular spacing of planter boxes, growing up creepers, like very much like Osea. That's also of vertical greenery. Then you can progress on to more complex systems like the cell systems where each individual pots carry a single plant, right? And then finally to the really extensive natural fabric systems. So there are really gradients of green walls, right? The ones that is just growing up creepers, those are cheap, right? And those can do most of the job, right? It may not look as beautiful or as biodiverse, but it does the job of cutting down the heat, right? Greening a bare wall, right? Providing visual interest, providing spaces for animals to hide and coexist with us. So, and I believe this can apply to the developing nations. Right? We have not, in my opinion, explored fully the potential of even these basic typologies.
But you can understand why the perception might be that this is, a plaything of rich countries. I mean, it is happening either in typologies like hotels and resorts where you see a lot of this, or Class A office buildings where you see this becoming very much a part of the branding of the project, or in places like Singapore where, we have these kind of systems and maintenance regimes in place and statutory codes. I mean, do you see this in translating to, say, social housing or a place like India? Are there examples that you've encountered where, and I know you mentioned ivy walls in the UK, but in high density conditions in Asian or African or Latin American cities which are developing and don't have the resources, do you see this idea, A, first of all, being implemented anywhere, but B, being practical, as solutions?
I think so. I do believe there is room for this kind of design, even in these developing countries. It's just, I'm not sure why it has not been more widely introduced, right? But if I understand the technology that's involved and the amount of maintenance, it should not be difficult, right? And we as designers, I think we owe it to them to actually, introduce to them the potential of using this kind of solutions to really, soften their urban environment and improve livability.
If a social housing developer in India were to come to you and say, help us build a green wall, well, what would you do?
You have to take into consideration local expertise, the building capabilities, right? Construction skill set, available materiality, the maintenance, education and capacity, right? The budget for construction. It will look different. It will be responsive, right? And as a result, I think you'll be more adapted to the system.
I'm reminded of a project by Rahul Mehrotra, who we interviewed in the podcast in season 1. It's an office building in Hyderabad in India. It's called the KMC Corporate Office Headquarters, I think. And it's basically a simple, rectilinear geometric form, but it's got a double skin system, and it's got an outer skin that's a green wall. And what always stays in my mind about that project is the argument he makes for the green wall. And he says that actually what it does is that it creates employment for 20 gardeners, So people in the community, it's not a high-tech solution as you might expect in Singapore, where, you've got these irrigation systems and so on. But it is a solution where low-cost labor, it creates employment basically for people. And he makes this very pointed note that the gardener who makes very little money is separated from the executive in the meeting room by a sheet of glass, and they see each other, in that same space, which I thought was an interesting point to make about equity.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting to hear that, one of his intentions was to create employment opportunities. Really generous of him. Typically, a private developer will try to look for a design that requires a minimum of manpower input, right? Maintenance, right? So it's refreshing to see, that he's actually using it as a tool, right, to engage with the community. And I think it demonstrates the diversity of solutions and what it can mean for different stakeholders. Right?
I hear this again and again in the conversations that we're having on this podcast with different designers, that what very often is approached as a technological solution in some countries, I suppose richer developed countries, is often seen as a social equity question in other countries, that, it's where labor costs are low and unemployment is problematic, that it actually is a way of putting money in people's pockets, so it serves a different goal. I mean, it's not a backup, but it's a different point of view of why you do this. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.